Great. Well, welcome everybody. I hope everybody is staying warm. It is sunny, a beautiful sunrise this morning. For today's grand rounds, I am delighted to introduce Carrie Gleason, who will be introducing our special guest lecturer, Dr. Peggye Dilworth-Anderson. So, Carrie.
Thanks, Dr. Schnapp. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker this morning. Dr. Peggye Dilworth-Anderson is a professor of health policy and management at the Gillings School of Global Public Health at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. After graduating from Tuskegee Institute, Dr. Dilworth-Anderson went on to obtain her master's and doctorate degree in sociology from Northwestern University. She completed postdoctoral training with the Midwest Council of Social Research Aging, Her research focus is on health disparities and Alzheimer's disease, with an emphasis on building knowledge for the scientific and lay community to inform best practices for conducting culturally relevant research and to inform how we disseminate information about Alzheimer's disease and related disorders in diverse medically underserved communities. Over her career, her excellent work, her leadership, and her service have been lauded by a number of distinguished organizations. In recognition of her research in aging, Dr. Dilworth-Anderson received the Pearmain Prize for Excellence in Research on Aging from the University of Southern California's Roy Bell Institute for Aging. This award exemplifies outstanding contributions to the field of translational aging research and its importance to issues directly related to older adults. She received the Ronald and Nancy Reagan Alzheimer's Research Award for her research contributions on Alzheimer's disease in medically underserved populations from the Alzheimer's Association's national chapter. And something I see as particularly admirable, Dr. Dilworth-Anderson has dedicated many years to training and mentoring graduate students, fellows, junior, mid-career faculty interested in the field of aging. In recognition of her mentoring, she received the Minority Task Force Mentor Award from the Gerontological Society of America and the UNC Faculty to Faculty Mentoring Award from the Carolina Women's Leadership Council. So Dr. Dilworth-Anderson is not one of my mentors, but she's one of my science heroes. We all know those scholars or writers whose work is infused with clarity and innovation, and I'm certain I'm not alone in saying that I have been deeply influenced by her ideas and her way of communicating her brilliance. If you remember that Gatorade commercial from the 1990s featuring Michael Jordan, you'll understand this reference. If not, look it up, it's cute. I don't want to be like Mike. I want to be like Dr. Peggye. So with that, I will turn things over to a true science hero, Dr. Peggye Dilworth-Anderson.
Well, thank you so much, Carrie. I appreciate that. Can you hear me clearly?
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate your comments and your introduction. And I have a lot of heroes and sheroes and heroes out there as well. And I so appreciate the university inviting me to share some of my ideas this morning and exchange ideas with others. I'd like to note to not reproduce or copy the information provided. I'm in the process of writing an article from this presentation, but I do want to share it with this audience as well as other audiences. There are several key topics that I'm going to discuss this morning. One is the reality of practicing science around Alzheimer's disease. And one of the things that I learned many years ago as a graduate student at Northwestern, I was trained in theoretical sociology and social psychology. And we studied a lot about how we practice science, how we come to know what we know, how do we generate knowledge, which in the 70s, of course, we didn't think of this as an inclusive way of thinking, but it was an inclusive way of thinking because we interrogated ourselves as well as interrogating the science of others, which gave us critical eyes in terms of why we're accepting what we're doing and what we're doing and critiquing ourselves along the way. In the study of Alzheimer's disease, I've come to the conclusion that, and I'm not alone in this, that we need a paradigm shift toward an inclusive approach to the study of Alzheimer's. And in this preparation for the shift, I've written an article about we need to be ready. We get ready for a lot of things. And as scientists, we need to get ready. We can alter our approaches. We can look at what we learned maybe decades ago. And what I learned at Northwestern University, I got my doctorate in 1975. A lot of what I learned, I can't use today. It's not relevant. But a lot of what I did learn, I can use. So I have to clean the closet sometimes and determine if I'm ready to take on the next task, given my knowledge and my skills at the present time. In the process of moving this way of thinking, we have to also interrogate the fundamental influences that have shaped the way that we view our research in the questions that we ask. So in this shift, I think we need to interrogate those influences that have influenced us as well as can influence the paradigm shift. And in this shift, there are roles by researchers as well as study participants and communities. One of the things that I have found to be very helpful, and as well as other scientists, is that we need to center our thinking around disease, around care, around interventions from a life course perspective. I've studied the life course perspective, not just in graduate school, but in my postdoctoral training and going back to school, taking courses and different things over my career to understand life course, is to actually center the person, not where we meet them, but center them in their journey from childhood all the way up to the point that they're sitting in our office or we're researching them or asking them questions. And in this centering, we need to think about the social determinants of health. What determine or what help determine what is happening to this individual? And so in this shift, we need to, again, center our individuals, our communities around social determinants of health. This leads to a more inclusive way of understanding people and also recruiting. Currently, our samples are very biased toward white middle class. They lack racial and cultural diversity, and they limit rural populations. And we have a lot of rural families in America of all racial and ethnic backgrounds. So ultimately, what leads to what we call our science, and I read a lot of things and contributed myself, our interpretations, therefore, are not inclusive. So the paradigm shift is a fundamental change, as we all know, around our scientific assumptions and the practice of science. And this is a part of my own life course journey of self-educating and having been formally educated is to question and interrogate again myself in terms of what's my fundamental knowledge about this population? What do I know? What assumptions should I make given the people standing in front of me or the people that I want to stand in front of me or sit in front of me? So the scientist changes the way he or she thinks about and conceptualizes the problem when we are moving into this paradigm shift. The shift then gets us into new skills and expertise. We ask different questions, new questions. We examine and interrogate our measures. We may add new measures. We may refine the measures we have. One of the things that I did some years ago, I think it's been over a decade ago now, I developed a scale called the Cultural Justifications for Caregiving. And I'm proud to say that it's been interpreted in numerous languages globally. I get information from scientists from all over the world where they adapt the measure. And the reason I developed that measure was because in the stress process of understanding the impact of Alzheimer's on caregiving, a lot of people talked about stress. Well, in certain cultures, people don't internalize the stress that other people may internalize. So they may not be affected by stress in caregiving as other populations may be. And so I listened to my caregivers when they talked about, I'm not stressed, I feel something else. And particularly for African Americans. I won't go through all the methodologies that I use to get to this 10-item measure, but I stayed true to my science, did all the work that I was supposed to do, starting with conversations, focus groups, interrogating my knowledge from that, and moving on, long story short, to a 10-item, very sound measure that has been very predictive of certain outcomes that caregivers experience. So hopefully from an experience like that, we can generate new knowledge around Alzheimer's caregiving. In this process of the paradigm shift, true to my theoretical sociology background, we always thought about, you got to kind of map it out. What are the things that are really influencing you? And how do they interact and transform the way that you want to think? And so if you can tell from this figure, the foundational influence are structural factors that really set the platform. And this is why I put the long bar at the bottom, because we have institutional factors, historical factors that influence not only what we learn, but how we practice, the interventions we provide, even medications we prescribe, understanding what our patients or what our participants are telling us and understanding those things. And there are numerous factors that then these foundational influences, as you can see from the figure, move straight up through all the other boxes. And these boxes are reflective of the factors that come into play from my perspective and that of others to help us understand how to move toward this paradigm shift. And I'm going to move a bit further from the figure and talk about these different aspects of the figure. The foundational shift includes institutional norms. Institutional norms around the educational institutions, from elementary school to postgraduate level. It's been a while since I got my doctorate at Northwestern, which I dearly love, and of course my undergraduate work at Tuskegee, which I love even more, had a great influence on my worldview. Beyond my elementary education, it really gave me a sense of not who I was, but also the context in which I was becoming an adult female, which was the 60s, a period of a lot of social change in America, wanting to see things differently, very much like Black Lives Matter today, in terms of how young adults are wanting to transform some of the institutions that have set in place the practices and norms that we accept as everyday behavior or everyday thinking. And so there are certain learned and accepted scientific practices that we engage in that have been normalized. Now, something normalized doesn't mean that it's right. And normalized isn't normal in another historical time. And so normal then needs quotes around it, because then we know that normal can be fluid. What's normal now can be redefined. And therefore, our research, the way that we have practiced studying Alzheimer's disease, needs to be redefined so that it's more inclusive. And of course, our labor force practices have historically excluded racial and ethnic individuals in the scientific fields. And there's lots of evidence to support that. We know that when there's lack of diversity, we have lack of diversity in thinking, lack of diversity in terms of ways of seeing the world. And then what we want on our teams are people who have great knowledge, of course, but also have different life experiences. And so gender can influence that, okay? Race can influence it, ethnicity, age, whether one grew up in an urban versus rural community. All of these factors come into play as a scientist. And then these structural factors that have really been critical to some of the work that I have worked on and committees that I serve on, trying to make a difference in the scientific world. I highlighted the 1993 Revitalization Act, which was passed in 93 as a result, or I should say as a result, in response to what happened with the Tuskegee experiment. So the Revitalization Act was passed to direct NIH to establish guidelines for the inclusion of women and minorities in clinical research. Of course, we have not obeyed this act, okay? The statute was not revised, but expanded and included more in language more recently. And one of the things that I have said repeatedly, and I've served on council at NIA and served in other leadership roles in the US, one being president of the Gerontological Society of America, is that we as scientists have not adhered to what legally and federally we're supposed to do. We have excluded the most vulnerable populations around this disease. We have biased our research, and we've done good research on the people we've done research on, but that's not good enough. We need to establish good science, not just to be in legal compliance, but also good science for the people. So these foundational factors of laws and norms and rules are very critical. And I have said to a number of key people in this country, when are we going to stay within the law? And who's responsible for us being outside of the law? These are things as scientists we need to be aware of. If we're part of it, we need to stop that, because at the end of the day, we are addressing the needs of people who are in dire condition. So the 1993 National Institutes of Health Revitalization Act requires the enrollment of women and all minorities in clinical. Women and minorities must be included in phase 3 clinical trials. Grant proposals must include women and minority inclusion plans. I want to say, and I may be speaking to some people in the audience, is that if you've served on committees at the NIH, you know that many times we don't adhere to this. I've chaired committees, I've served on committees, and to my dismay and to my disappointment, many of these things are not adhered to. As scientists, we have the obligation to do these things and hold each other accountable for them. We want good science that leads to good care, good intervention, and good services for people with Alzheimer's disease. So part of the paradigm shift requires of us to continue to interrogate ourselves, as I've noted earlier. One of the concepts that's true to interrogation in training, which I engage in myself, is what is described as cultural reflexivity. It's the researcher's awareness of his or her analytic focus in relationship to the study and the community. In other words, how I was trained then gives me an analytic focus, which then determines how I'm going to study something. And as I noted earlier in my discussion, my training at Northwestern University and getting a doctorate in 1975 is literally not appropriate in some ways because of the differences in how we see the world now, how the world has changed since 1975. So we also need to overcome misrecognition of cultures by invoking culture in contextualized and nuanced ways. Sometimes we misrecognize, we misplace, we mislabel people because we're not really clear on what the culture is all about. Researchers need to attend to the ways that cultural practices involve consciousness and commentary on themselves. When I'm with African American caregivers, most of the time, African American women, and studying them, I don't assume because we're both Black women that I'm conscious of their life journey. We may be racially identical or look alike, but we're not the same as people because our life course may have differed dramatically. And therefore, I'm going to examine myself. Am I listening to her or him from my perspective? Am I involved in my consciousness of this person, less about me, but more about the individual I'm listening to? Training also requires lack of understanding of interpretations of study participants and misrecognizing. And sometimes our training doesn't give us the ability to get an inclusive sample. If you're like me, if you've read many articles in the highest level journals in this country and sometimes in the world, some of our top scientists say they were too difficult, they were too hard to get. and then report 3 and 4 and 5% African American or Latinos, 2% rural communities. Well, in the world that I have chosen to live in, and in the world that I often live in, saying that it's too difficult is not acceptable. Saying that it's hard to get is not acceptable, because then that tells me I have not done my work. And if we exclude the most vulnerable to this disease, which tend to be, well, not 10, who are African Americans and Latinos, we have not addressed the problem. And we have certainly not lived up to the 1993 Revitalization Act. So our training using one size fits all to community engagement will not work. Misidentification will not work. The inability to understand community dynamics won't work. The unwillingness to have researchers with strong community backgrounds, having relationships with community leaders, that won't work for us to really address this disease. So, and lack of diversity in research teams, that won't work either. And so what I am a great advocate of is accepting my training. Hopefully you'll accept yours, but also interrogate your training. By interrogation, again, examine where the gaps are. And if that's not possible, have exchanges with other people who are not trained like you to talk about your research approach and the things that you have typically done that have not been inclusive, and how one can move beyond that. So our research approach, therefore, have led to restrictive inclusion criteria, location of study sites, specialists versus generalists as referral-based, and lack of planning of cost and time. Now, when I served on council at NIA, one of the things that came up and comes up repeatedly in the scientific world, this is going to cost a lot. We need to put that in our budgets. Let the NIA or the other institutes decide that, which they should. Of course, they're not adhering to the Revitalization Act, but somewhere in the structural, these foundational influences, someone has to decide at what point are we going to really engage in the science that we needed in the manner that the people need us to, so that we can lead to better care, better intervention, and better services. And therefore, put your cost in. The plans that are very restrictive in terms of cost, those are plans that won't get us the kinds of samples we need. Well, scientists often say it takes so long to get these samples. Yes, it may have less to do with the population, but more about our skills in terms of cutting down that time to engage the communities so they can understand what we're doing. We create a process of trustworthiness and representation of the communities on the research team, so that the communities know or feel that their voices may be heard. We also want to look at culture and context. We don't want to continue with cultural disconnect. We want to focus on low literacy, language differences, history of discrimination and mistreatment. And oftentimes people will talk about the Tuskegee experiment. Well, discrimination firsthand, as well as historical, when I say firsthand in terms of myself, is both proximal and distal. I used to say to my students, I'm not teaching anymore, is that discrimination is not about what happened in the 1930s and 40s. It's what happened in the grocery store yesterday, or in Walmart, or another store this morning. And so we have to think about, it isn't the history of discrimination, it's the life lived with discrimination. And again, that gets back to, are we examining and interrogating our understanding of what discrimination looks like and feels like when we're interacting with people? So therefore, our research experience, oftentimes we create a lack of trust in the scientific community, lack of understanding and exposure of clinical research for our communities, lack of awareness and processes involving them in clinical trials. I have had numerous, if not hundreds and thousands of minority communities, of people in minorities communities say, I didn't know that I needed to be in the research. No one asked me. And so when we say hard to get, and I do talk in communities in some of my community work over the years or decades now, how the communities feel about us saying they're hard to get. We don't have enough time for me to describe a lot of those responses, but we want to be trustworthy. We want to expose our communities. So we need education. Sometimes we have to do town hall meetings or partner with community organizations to build relationships before we start asking people to get into our research. And I must say that colleagues at the University of Wisconsin have truly created some of the best models in the country around community engagement and including diverse communities in their research. And these are models that many of us can copy and emulate. So the researcher's readiness and retooling, this is part of this whole idea of readiness, interrogation. What is the relevant education training on diversity, relevant experience in researching diverse groups, working collaboratively, using theoretical and conceptual models that guide our recruitment and retention. Oftentimes when I'm reviewing applications, I look for it when I get to the recruitment process. What's the conceptual ideas behind, what are the conceptual ideas behind what they're proposing to do? And many times I don't see that. And that is a big problem. Recruitment and retention are conceptual in nature. They are theoretical. They need values and beliefs about what will work. And we need to test some of these things before we get out into communities. Using existing NIH resources to enhance recruitment efforts. More and more of these resources are made available. But readiness and retooling, these are exercises that I personally interrogate myself around. When I am researching a community or a group of people, I want to know if I'm trained enough, if I really understand to some degree the experiences, and particularly for me, an example, working in rural North Carolina, that has been an experience for me, and working in communities like the Native community, Indigenous people, these were new experiences for me. And in social psychology years ago, we would call them our Confederates. And of course, because I didn't know the cultures very well, I used one of my colleagues who's at Minnesota now as one of my people to put a buzz in my ear. Am I doing the right thing? Should I ask it this way? And I also hired the wife of one of the chiefs of one of the tribes to be on my research team. I also hired Native young people to be interviewers and had them to come to campus, train them, expose them to the university, and give them a view of their potential. This is a place that you can come, although they were doing research, but at the same time, I wanted to give them something, and I did, I paid them, but at the same time, I engaged in a lot of mentoring in terms of their educational aspirations. Engage in self-reflection, identify and discard assumptions about groups. Strive to realize that restrictive studies do not help all populations. Understand then that your and the participant's cultural frame. And the cultural frame allows researchers to understand how an individual culture is developed. Culture influences the human phenomena that a researcher is interested in studying. Culture creates the dynamics of understanding people and their life course development and journey. And again, it gets back to the words that I've used repeatedly: self-interrogation, self-examination as a researcher. And it's not throwing away what we've learned. It's knowing the limitations of our knowledge, altering that knowledge, not using when it's not appropriate, continuing to examine where that knowledge fits, examining what additional knowledge needs to be expanded, who on my team can complement my knowledge. Many times I can't educate myself and re-educate myself. Most of the time I can't, but I'm very much aware of who else can complement what I know, so that I have a larger view of this problem from the perspective of the people. Expand recruiting beyond specialty care centers. Use social marketing to reduce participants' lack of access to information and comprehension about clinic. Reduce participants and fears of exploitation, fears of unintended consequences, financial constraints, and competing demands on their times. I'm involved in a large national clinical trial now, and I must say to the audience, I have tried my best to adhere to most of what I'm sharing with you today. I'd like to say that what I write and what I promulgate, I first start with myself as best as I can. And many of these ways of addressing, I do have my checklist. And sometimes I know I'm not in bounds, but I'm aware that I need to be in bounds. And sometimes it requires of us as professionals to just listen and to know that listening is very key to self-interrogation, because it gives us some time to be self-reflective as scientists and understanding how to eliminate or reduce the barriers between ourselves and the communities that we want to care about, study, and provide services for. I'm going to skip this a bit because there's quite a bit on this slide, but the idea here is that we want to partner with community organizations and leaders, like the example that I gave earlier about working in the Native communities here in North Carolina with a particular tribe. It was important that I met with the chiefs. It was important that I met with the elders in the community, understanding their social norms, their belief systems. I spent a lot of time in those communities. My research team and I, we would leave campus and stay gone sometimes overnight because we were a bit exhausted and couldn't drive back to Chapel Hill after a day in the community. We want to employ follow-up focus groups and interviews, use cultural knowledge to translate and disseminate information. This is very key. This is how we sustain our research. We may have to go back to the same people. We want to leave behind an image of us as researchers, that we've engaged in inclusive research. We've heard the voices of the people. The people have heard our voices. They understand our research as best they can. They know the research is relevant to them. They know that it's translatable to their needs and services and care. And we have community partners that we can always go back to and have a relationship with. And we want to create that feedback loop among researchers, participants, communities, to continue to refine and retain our recruitment processes for future clinical research and trials. This is something that I'm very hypervigilant about in terms of my own work, making sure that the feedback loop is never closed on our side, and keeping in touch with individuals that are in groups that I no longer use in my research, but I keep my relationships with them. And of course, we want to translate again and make sure we use organizations to help us in these translations. We want stakeholders to be there for us. We want to apply and adhere to the established American laws and regulations that direct science, particularly and with a focus on the 1993 Revitalization Act. You know, I say sometimes, just because no one is looking doesn't mean that we're not doing harm. Just because no one checks the box on us, it doesn't mean that we're not doing harm. So exclusion is harmful because we use knowledge that doesn't reflect the people who are in need of our care, our interventions, and our services. So we want to adhere to laws, of course, but we really want to adhere to good science, which leads to good care, good interventions, and good services. Establish inclusivity as a priority in our clinical research and research initiatives. And we have to define for ourselves, what is inclusivity? What does inclusion look like for me? And if it's narrow, it's not big enough. And if it's too broad, it means that we can't harness enough. And so there are many ways that we can create this. that's effective for the community, for our partners, for the individuals with the disease, as well as the families and us as researchers and practitioners. We want to work to bring organizational and institutional change to create diversity and inclusion in our clinical trials and our clinical research. I'm going to stop there and just move toward opening up our discussion now for the audience. If you have any comments and questions, I'm very open to your questions and comments and feedback. And thank you for listening.
Great. Well, thank you so much for a really wonderful and thoughtful discussion. Maybe if you can stop sharing. Now, since we worked so hard to get you to share, there it is. Thank you. And while we're waiting for questions, one thing that I was wondering if you could elaborate on is, how do you disseminate the results of a study to the community that participated in it, and how you approach that?
Well, for me, I approach it very early on in my research. I don't wait until I get my findings and say, gee, I need to disseminate this. And so what I've learned over the years is to get a community board or a community advisory board to help me understand. And it doesn't always have to be a formalized board, but these are people that we're in contact with. And so one of the ways that communities have shared with me very early on is that we don't want a journal article. Okay. We don't want to get, p-values, okay, and charts. We want bullet points. We want we don't want long narratives, and we want some image of us in the findings. Okay, it needs to be personalized so that they can understand it. They also want us to give them something back from what we've learned about them. So one of my large studies that I did, I created based on my advisory board, a family caregiving resource guide. And GlaxoSmithKline funded most of that research. And I got some additional funds from the Office of Research at UNC. I appealed to the vice president there, and he bought it, or she bought it. And I created this resource guide that my graduate students and I, and my postdocs, based on what the caregivers said they wanted in it. Now, the guide is really a spiral book with the kinds of information they said when they are in need of information, they can just go to this book instead of trying to work on flyers or a pamphlet they got. And many of them working in rural North Carolina, they don't have computers or in any place, whether it's urban or rural. Many caregivers and family members don't navigate the internet like we do. And someone would say, well, go on the Alzheimer's Association website. They have a lot of resources. My caregivers would tell me that. And they said when they would go to the website, it was so overwhelming that they couldn't navigate it very well. So long story short, my caregivers and patients informed me. 2 pieces of information that I'd like to share in the resource guide I could not find based on what the caregivers needed. How to brush my mother's teeth without getting bitten, and what happens with urinary incontinence. So I asked a professor in our dental school who focused on caring for oral care of people with Alzheimer's. He wrote a beautiful set of guidelines and procedures for caregivers that I put in the guide. The other, I asked one of my colleagues in the School of Nursing who specialized in urinary incontinence. She wrote a beautiful piece for the caregivers based on just sitting around the table saying, what is it that you're struggling with? What is it that you really want to know? And many caregivers have been harmed trying to brush the teeth with an oral care of their loved ones. And that's very hard to even glean from any information as a layperson from our literature as scientists. So Lynn, what I do, I let the community inform me. in terms of content, a lot of it I put in, as well as the mechanism they want to receive the information in.
Yeah. But you don't send them the reprints necessarily.
No, no
Yeah.
reprints, unless they want it.
Right.
And of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Thank you. And then there's a great question from Fabu Phyllis Carter. We continue, despite the rules and regulations for the NIH, we continue to see researchers proposing trials and comment about the difficulty to ensure a diverse participant population. So how do we enforce the regulations that NIH has in place, and how do we move away from that exclusive discriminatory research?
Well, that's a big question for a big answer, and we really don't have enough time, but I'll give it my best. This is a structural problem. This is an American problem. This is a systemic form of racism and discrimination. HHS is responsible for NIH. NIH is responsible for what it does. We are responsible for what we do as scientists. So let's start with the scientists at the bottom and work up. You remember that arrow in that conceptual model? The foundational influences, the structural factors. So we have institutions that promulgate discrimination and racism, okay, called the NIH. So if we allow study sections to continue to do this at the risk of excluding the most vulnerable people to this disease that CMS is paying billions to care for, it doesn't make sense. So as scientists at the individual level, we say, how am I contributing to this structural discrimination? So it's bigger than a person. So we as scientists need to own that structural discrimination. It's hard to hear for some people, but let's be real about it, okay? We know that this is existing, and your question is right on target. It exists because it's allowed to exist. They're not interrogating themselves because no one is holding them accountable to interrogate themselves. So our scientists, as scientists, we can put pressure first on ourselves, on each other, and we can put pressure on NIH continuing to do that. But hey, if you're getting a lot of cookies and they taste good, why would you bite the hand that gives you the cookie? Okay, so we get funded and we're not held accountable. And then it gets published in the highest level journals, which gets promulgated again throughout the system. And we teach from that. We get trained from that. We care from that. We develop interventions from that. It becomes more and more ingrained in the structure, which we call systemic discrimination and racism and sexism, ageism, classism, locationism. Yes.
And what really resonated with me as you were presenting is talking about, we need to be rethinking our budgets and our budget proposals to be able to incorporate the additional interventions that we need. And that means the NIH has to be able to fund that.
This is the time to stop doing that. And I say that knowing from lots of experience. Put in what
we need, right?
Put in what you need.
Yes.
This interrogation is happening and it should continue to happen. We as scientists need to own this. A lot of people don't want to hear it because we're participants in it, okay? But self-examination and self-reflection are key components to good science. Some of the best science went against the grain. And I do believe what Thomas Kuhn said in The Structure of Scientific Revolution. A paradigm shift requires examining the norm. We would not be in many places today if we did not examine the norm. Norms become non-normal. Norms become renormed. I sit as a renormed American.
It does remind me of these Young Frankenstein, Abby Normal.
It's norm is variable, it's contextual, it's historical, it's social,
Yeah.
it's psychological.
And there,
Thank you for that reference to Thomas Kuhn. That's I put the name of the book in
Yes.
the chat for everyone.
wow.
It's a way of thinking about like really turning the field on its head.
Yes,
And a paradigm shift is it's an inflection point.
it is.
Be
It
better.
is.
So
We're there.
thank you for my liberal arts education. That book was
Yes.
part of my education. It's an oldie but goodie. I recommend it.
It's timeless. It's
So-
timeless for us as practitioners, scientists, interventionists, because what it says to us is this: we have knowledge, but knowledge is variable, it's historical, it's contextual. What was learned then can be unlearned and reshaped. What's acceptable can become unacceptable.
Mhm.
And so what we're talking about this morning, and we should be talking about this, is that yes, we're capable of doing better because we're also smart. We've been educated, we've been exposed, but we've been normalized in a structure that allows this kind of systemic exclusion. But at the end of the day, and many of us don't see these people, we then advocate suffering and death.
Yes, we do have a question from Daud Siraj, who asks, first of all, he comments that it's a great talk. Thank you, Dr. Dilworth-Anderson. So many ideas that we can take in our quest to diversify our department in every aspect, including inclusivity in research. His question is, how can we translate this to make it a bedrock of all research we do? Do we create a team who looks into recruitment of diverse subjects? Any thoughts? Daud, I invite you to meet my team led by Dr. Carter, Dr. Fabu Carter. She's doing fantastic work. We've done something like this, but I want to hear Dr. Dilworth-Anderson's answer to that question.
Well, as I noted before, my example working in the Native community, the wife of one of the chiefs was on my team. I hired people in the community, the young adults who needed jobs. Okay, and what my another person that was on my team, Sadie, who was in the community, she said to me and my graduate students and my postdocs, you guys don't need to, when you finish working with us, just get in your cars and drive back to Chapel Hill. You need to eat in the community so that people can see you. They know you're here, but you're not with them. So that would extend our day. And I'm paying people, okay? That's not in the budget, by the way, because this is what's happening. But it got changed. And these are things I learned along the way. So we would eat our lunch there, or if we were late in the field, we would eat an early dinner at local restaurants. And so the people would come by our table, we could talk to them, and they validated us. And we were becoming a part of them, accepting them. And so we went to the community, social community building where the elders, I'm an amateur quilter, and some of the elders in the community took pity on me and taught me a few techniques. So I sat around a quilting horse for hours. And one of my colleagues who's Native said to me, don't do a lot of talking, Peggy. That's kind of quite American. Just listen. And the listening was the silence and the lack of voice, but the physical acceptance and the acceptance of my presence, which is a different cultural way of being accepted. And I learned some really great techniques in my quilting, and they took pity on me, I must say, in my poor quilting, but I learned a few things. So there are ways that gets put into the community readiness, the readiness part. What does it require for readiness? Right now in our clinical trial that we have now going on, we're developing community champions. These are people in the communities that we are training. I have a 4-hour training coming up soon training people who are local people in the communities who want the disease to be addressed. We partnered with different organizations and working with a large team of people across the country on this research. But right now, we're getting our champions ready, boots on the ground. They're not our graduate students. They're not postdocs. They're not us. These are community people. And again, Wisconsin has done a great job with that. I do keep up with you guys quite a bit on that. And your model is one to be modeled in terms of community connections. So those are that's a short but long answer to your question, Dr. Gleason.
So we do have another question. Lynn, do you want to ask Eric's question?
Sure. So it's an interesting question about perspectives on regulatory issues for inclusion in therapeutic trials, particularly for vulnerable populations, with a specific ask in some malignancies like myeloma, where we have clinical trials that are improving long-term outcomes and high probability of getting patients to live longer. The challenge is myeloma is twice as common in African Americans, and given the inequalities in incarcerated populations, they are in general ineligible for participation in research studies because of their being deemed a vulnerable population. So how do we, what are your thoughts on that? Engaging with allowing or getting those vulnerable populations to participate in interventions and research that would be a potential benefit for them?
Well, I would start with the community. The community has a lot of knowledge about how and why people accept us as scientists. What they know about their own communities in terms of how they've normalized acceptance. It may not fit our IRB, by the way, and the restrictions we have in that, which is a whole nother discussion.
Yeah.
But if we start with, and I have done this, with focus groups, this is what I'm interested in learning. This is before any interview, any person you've brought into your sample. Let's talk about your community in this problem or disease, or how we can address it. What are your thoughts on this? The communities have a lot of information they can give us on approaches. This is why partnerships are so critical to the kind of work of moving toward an inclusive approach. Inclusive approach isn't just about the subject being there in the study. Inclusive approach is about the process. So it is getting back to square one, 1A, 1B, and you're still in this is all before enrollment. And this is where the cost comes and the time comes. The timelines are off. The cost is off. And this is a very good time in our society and in this culture to be aware of that. And as scientists, we can push this, that we need time to do these studies because there are no models hardly out there for us to address the most vulnerable populations. So if we don't have these vulnerable populations, we can't use a model and say, oh, I can get them in a year, I can get them in 2 years. That may double. That may double. Yeah. And so that means pushing the budget out 2-3 years longer or a year longer. So don't shorten your time on recruitment, because the front end preparation, I can't begin to tell you how much time we've spent just getting champions. We haven't even started training. Okay, so that's a short answer to a very long answer.
And that's a good preamble for another question from Amy Kind, who is asking, the need to re-examine our traditional R01 funding mechanisms, and your thoughts on the development of a different mechanism that allows us, that supports that building of the relationships over time and the infrastructure and the stepwise approach that's needed, which doesn't really fit into the traditional NIH, R01 budget structure. Are there any discussions at the NIH for that?
I don't know about that. I don't know, but I actually think the R01 structure can be, if it's legal, can be amended and allowing us to really think about how we're going to approach our research. That research plan is critical, and our budget is critical to that plan. So Dr. Kine that's a very provocative question of creating another mechanism. But I'm somewhat of a traditionalist, although I think of myself as not being a traditionalist. It's that, why tear down the house when you already have it built? Let's renovate it. Okay. So we got the R01 structure. What can we do with that? Let's interrogate that structure. More importantly, let's interrogate what we're doing with that. I think, off the top of my head, it's more about what we're not doing with the R01. Why would we continue to fund researchers decade after decade with 3% African American in it and twice as likely to have Alzheimer's disease? That's a good funding source, but the process is off. The Revitalization Act, why do we need another act? Let's adhere to what we've already created. So I think it's provocative in an alternative, but my thing is, let's not tear down the house. Let's examine what we're doing in it in the R01 that could get us to a better place. And that's the job of NIH. That's their job, and HHS, to do that.
Yeah, and us, because we populate the study sections.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely. They can be very hard to sit in.
We actually might have some NIH program officers on the call. So
I'm very happy that they are.
I'm
very happy they are.
Yes.
Yes.
We do
Because
have
I am a big proponent of structural examination, owning up in America, those of us who are in charge of these structures that define us as America. Research defines us because it leads to care, services, and intervention. That reflects longevity, life course, time of death, what I die from, what I suffer with. This is very profound. We're talking about more than grants here. We're talking about people's lives. So I'm happy that they're there.
And then another question, a slightly different question. Are there cultural differences with how different groups view dementia and how they may deal with it differently than a traditional healthcare system does?
Absolutely. And there's enough evidence on that in the literature that different people see dementing, what we call dementing behaviors, in the context of their lives, in the context of their history, in the context of their understanding of diseases. Okay. And norms get established within the cultural norms. And so the presentation of the behaviors may be maybe different across different cultures. And I know this, I've presented on this, and I'm sorry, I have a whole grid on just what you're asking, where different cultures, what was the first sign that your mother or your father or your spouse or whatever exhibited? And what we call signs and symptoms, they're quite variable culturally because of how people experience themselves within culture. One of the things that we know about African Americans, and having lived as an African American all of my life, is that we absorbed, because of the historical presence of persistent discrimination and racism. So our culture absorbs stressors. So a person can appear not okay, we absorb that person. And we envelop that person within the system that protects them, that tolerates that to some degree, and I use norm with a small n, normalize that. And then, as some of my caregivers would say to me when I would be talking with them, the doctors or the clinicians would ask, when did this start? And when they say, like 10 years ago, 5, have you seen anybody before that? No, we just accepted it, or whatever. And so when we look at different cultures, and there's quite a bit of literature on this. Neil Henderson at Minnesota has done great work in this area. It's very anthropological and very cross-cultural that we need to be aware of. So presenting the disease for a late diagnosis, maybe it could be a cultural thing. Yeah. In terms of what certain cultures perceive as deviant or abnormal, out of the range behavior.
So thank you. We are at the hour. I do want to make a plug. Carrie Gleason just put in the chat that Dr. Dilworth-Anderson is going to be presenting tomorrow at the Solomon Carter Fuller event, sponsored by the Alzheimer's and Dementia Alliance of
Wisconsin. Our group.
Oh, our group.
University
Okay.
As well. So yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Carrie. The information to register is in the chat. I want to thank you again. It's been delightful and thought-provoking and very timely and an important topic. So thank you, and I hope everyone enjoys the weekend. Take care.
Thank you for inviting me and listening. Thank you, audience.
And hopefully in person someday soon.
Absolutely. Bye now.
Take care. Thank you.
Dr. Dilworth-Anderson, before you hang up, if we have a few moments to ask, I know if we are not going to show your slides, I'm wondering if we could edit and keep the recording of just this conversation for people to watch would be fantastic.
Absolutely. And I'd like to note a last closing remark, if I may, that I officially retired from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in June, on June 30th. July 1, they reappointed me as a research professor.
Yeah.
And I stepped down as a full professor of decades to devote my time to the people and to structures that affect the people. So I will continue to do my research, engaging with colleagues like those at the University of Wisconsin and beyond. I will continue to do research, but I'm no longer teaching. I will continue to do my clinical research in this area and engage in these kinds of conversations. So I'd like to say I'm in the encore of my career at this point. So I wanted to share that with my audience, and I am working in systems to affect change.
Okay, and can I ask another random question?
Mm-hmm.
Just curious, on your chair, is that a quilt that you made?
No, that's not.
Okay.
That's a shawl someone gave me. It's very ethnic, and sometimes I get a little chilly, so I like to keep it close by.
Yeah. Okay.
No, my quilting isn't good enough to display, by the way.
Well, you got practice.
I got to keep practicing.
Excellent. All right.
Thank you again for having me. Bye now.
Bye-bye.